On February 19th, 2019, Riot published the short story Silence for the Damned. It's notable for a few reasons. For one thing, it expanded the lore of the Freljord by explaining something about Sejuani, the Winter's Claw, and her relationship to the various shamanic tribes of the Freljord. For another, it was actual narrative lore content for Udyr, a character who hasn't had much of that, shall we say. It also softly confirmed that Udyr is Sejuani's father. Now, in the style of Riot, it confirmed it in such a way that if Riot ever decide to go back on that and retcon it out of existence, they technically can explain it away, in the same way that for the longest time they never explicitly confirmed that Vi and Jinx are sisters, but let's be real, Udyr is Sejuani's father. They can retcon it away, but for the moment that seems to be true. What stood out to me the most about the story, though, is its inclusion of a third champion, the Volibear. Now, much like Udyr, Volibear has not exactly been a popular subject of the lore for quite a long time, and so I was fascinated to see the otherwise rather goofy-looking Thunderbear described in Silence for the Damned like this. Taller than a mammoth, it stepped out of the woods. Walls of muscle, each limb larger than a man, propelled the beast forward. Its broken, ancient armor of dark metal plates was caked brown by the dried gore of hundreds of battles. Broken weapons, rusted with age, jutted from its back and shoulders. One half of its face had been stripped of flesh, revealing oily bone, teeth, and horns. From its mouth, an unnatural black blood dripped. And then, later, when Volibear has gouged himself on the souls of the people that it has killed, alone, and in the middle of the city, the bear spirit's avatar impaled corpses on stakes, arranged in some unknowable pattern. Black branches and roots grew from the speared bodies around the beast like worms slowly crawling from the earth. The flesh and fur on the Volibear's face had healed. Its muscles seemed thicker, stronger than before. The Volibear's eyes turned to Udyr as the shaman approached. Across its face, a dozen new eyes bloomed, each as dark and cold as a spider's. Which, wow, that's a really interesting take on a war god, some ancient eldritch being from the heart of the woods, which is unknowable in its terrible strangeness. Fascinating. A great direction to take this rather silly armored Thunderbear. But then a bunch of salty Volibear mains complained that this isn't my Volibear, and now we ended up with this middle-of-the-road nonsense instead. Thanks a lot, cowards. Okay, so in case you couldn't tell, I'm a little bit salty that we got robbed of Eldritch Horror Volibear in favor of something more traditional, but I just wanted to be sure everybody understands, I was kidding in the intro. It's okay to want something more traditional, I just have my preferences, and I was being humorously hyperbolic about it. Anyway, approximately 5,000 million years ago, Riot revealed their final Volibear rework and visual update, which came as a surprise to absolutely nobody because people had voted on which champion should get a rework, and Volibear had scored pretty highly on that scale. Now, where the previous rework of Fiddlesticks had essentially recreated the champion from scratch, creating something entirely new, based only around the shared common theme of being a living horror-themed scarecrow, the Volibear rework hews much more traditional, not so much aiming to remake the champion as to take the same concept that the champion originally embodied and bring it into line with the modern state of League of Legends. So history, as it so often has been, is the appropriate place to start with Volibear, to see what he once was in order to contrast it with what he has become. Before that though, let's just take a brief moment to go through some interesting... Did you know that in the early days of League of Legends, champions would sometimes be named after the staff at Riot? Well, you probably did, because of Tryndamere and Ryze, who were named after some of the founders of the company. But Volibear was named after a former producer called Travis Volibear George, who was known on the League of Legends forums for agitating really hard for armored bear champions in League of Legends. Another designer at Riot, though, Tom Silius Cadwell, was famously against the idea of putting armored bears in League of Legends because that would be ridiculous. Silius also had a champion named after him called Cillian, and to commemorate these differences, on Volibear's release, he was given a cosmetic buff, that is, a buff that doesn't really do anything but still sits on his status bar, called Chrono Keeper Hater, which would only show up if there was a Cillian on the opposing team. Volibear also became the first champion to have voice lines that triggered specifically upon killing a specific enemy champion.
I've a special claw for you, Zillion.
This history with Cillian is still referenced today with the rework.
Do you have something against bears, old man?
But we'll have to wait for a long overdue rework for Cillian to see whether or not he gets a line in response. Now, I don't usually do trivia sections in my What's the Deal videos, but I did it this time because there is a little bit of a point to it, and it is to point out that Volibear in his original conception was, at least in part, a joke champion. Not in the sense that Riot didn't take him seriously at all, but that the idea of an armored bear is an inherently slightly funny concept, to the point where it's the kind of thing that shows up in games like Red Alert 3 or Sejuani joke skins like this one. And this very much reflects the history of League of Legends. It was, especially in its early days, very much a campy cartoon fun game, and while it took its own lore relatively seriously, it didn't take it anywhere near as seriously as it does these days. So keep that tongue-in-cheek, slightly silly vibe in mind as we go through Volibear's early lore states. Volibear has always been associated with the Freljord, but in his first lore state, we see a very different bear than the one who currently stalks Summoner's Rift. In his original conception, Volibear is the tribal leader of the Ursine that live on the plains of the Freljord. Essentially, just like a whole race of enormous Bara furries walking around in the Freljord trying to survive against the element. Volibear's brother is killed during a hunt, and as Volibear is his brother's successor, he takes up the mantle of chieftain. In order to do that, though, he has to put on some ceremonial armor and climb a mountain and talk to a storm that's going to tell him stuff that he needs to know in order to be a chieftain. And what the storm decides to tell him is that there's a huge, big, great war coming, and it's going to be super bad, and all of your tribesmen are going to die. So that sucks for you. Goodbye. Volibear decides to react to this by traveling to the capital of the Freljord, where Queen Ashe, and this is in a previous lore state where Ashe could actually claim to be the queen of the Freljord, holds court. And in an attempt to prevent the terrible fate of the Ursine, he forms an alliance with her, becoming one of the staunchest allies of the Avarosans in the Freljord. Now, if you know the current Volibear, you may be surprised to learn that in his original conception he was actually a pacifist and a peacemaker, but there you are. In his second lore state, we see some echoes of the current version of Volibear begin to emerge. His story is mostly the same, but with a few retcons to accommodate the introduction of Lysandra into the lore. In this version of the lore, Volibear is a wise sage of his tribe, known for his insight and wisdom. Now, he's troubled by the idea that long periods of peace and prosperity are turning his tribe weak and soft and unable to defend themselves, and as he too climbs a mountain to get a vision from a storm in order to figure out what happens in the future, he too sees visions of his tribe lying dead on the fields of battle. In this case, though, they are slaughtered by terrible creatures of ice, very much implied to be the servants of Lysandra. Volibear takes up the mantle of leadership over the Ursine, revives their old martial traditions, and turns them into a formidable fighting force, and then allies himself, not with Ashe, but with Sejuani. So here, we see the warlike tendency of Volibear coming into his history, turning him from an advocate of peace into an advocate of bloody-minded struggle and war, which is something that'll carry over into his new modern rework. Now, remember how I said you should keep in mind the sort of tongue-in-cheek, slightly silly vibe of early League of Legends? Well, you may notice that Volibear's lore had exactly 0.0% of that vibe. It takes itself relentlessly seriously, which is very much how League of Legends operated. It had these character designs and character ideas that were fundamentally pretty silly, and then it told these very self-serious and often rather po-faced stories about them. Skarner is a scorpion made out of crystal, which is objectively kinda goofy, but he has this story about being the last of his race, desperately trying to protect the crystal consciousnesses of his people from those who would exploit it. Corki looks like this, but for most of his history, he had a lore that took him extremely seriously as the flying ace of a Bandle city, a relentless warrior and serious-minded inventor who thrives on danger and flies through enemy hot zones to deliver critical intelligence to the front line. Hence, Volibear, a character who is very silly in concept, but when taken sufficiently seriously can end up seeming, at least in hindsight, kinda cool and badass. And gee, I wonder which part of him it was that the rework took most care to replicate. Now, as for Volibear's old character design, there kinda isn't much to say about him. He's a bipedal white bear who wears a bunch of armor and some of it is glowing because it's magical, but that's kind of about it. Volibear is a grouchy old man who is upset that the kids these days don't do things the way we did them in the olden days. And it sounds like I'm being facetious about this, but no, that is literally his lore, actually. Volibear's bio opens with the legendary tales of how he formed the Freljord and how he was one of the mightiest gods in the early days of civilization, where everybody needed his might to survive on the cold, desperate plains of the Freljord. But then the three sisters had to come along and start doing civilization stuff and build houses and not freeze to death. And I guess kids these days are just too good to eat their meat raw. They have to cook it on fires and stuff. So grumpy old man Volibear observes the Freljord changing, observes people inventing new ways of life and improvements to their material conditions, and decides that he is gonna make the Freljord great again. Now, I don't mean to suggest, of course, that League of Legends has politics in it or something. It's just a video game. Like, video games don't have politics in them. That's just not a thing that exists in video games. Anyway, Noxus is an expansionist colonizing empire. Demacia is currently doing a genocide against an oppressed minority group whose only crime is to be born different. And the people of Son are struggling against relentless capitalist exploitation of their labor force on behalf of the rich upper class that lives in Piltover. Anyway, League of Legends definitely doesn't have any politics. You shouldn't think about this stuff. You shouldn't ever give any more thought than absolutely necessary to any of the media you consume. So, Volibear is, in the lore of League of Legends, one of the primordial gods of the Freljord, and along with Ornn and Anivia and his other siblings whose names have not all been told to us yet, like the Seal Sister or the Iron Boar, it is, according to legend, their early exploits and conflicts and the things that they choose to do with their time that gives shape to the land of the Freljord. The legend goes, for example, that the Freljord gained its many mountains and valleys after Ornn had a giant, basically a fight with the land, literally punching it into the shape that it ended up having, while the many rivers and valleys of the Freljord are often said to be the result of Volibear's struggle with various legendary creatures. For example, the blood he spills from a legendary magma serpent is said to be the source of the first river in the Freljord. And going by the story's Stormbringer, Volibear has essentially been dormant for a while because so many people stopped worshipping him, stopped honoring the old ways, and stopped making blood sacrifices to him. He has entered into a kind of slumber state from which he awakens when a desperate tribe of Freljordians who are being set upon by Noxus call upon him for power and assistance. Which introduces some interesting questions, because in Silence for the Damned, the story I quoted at the start of the episode, we learn that the cult of Volibear, the Ursine, have been active in the Freljord for a long time indeed. They are an established power, a known quantity that Sejuani calls upon for aid. But of course, the Volibear that they summon is very different to the Volibear who's called upon by the Freljordian tribe to take on the Noxians. And this, I think, is at least in part an artifact of Riot not quite anticipating how much antipathy Volibear mains especially would have towards their Eldritch Abomination version of Volibear, and they've had to make some slightly awkward pivots to how his story is told in order to square the pure and divine Volibear with the thousand-pierced Volibear, which seems to be closer to the entity that the Ursine specifically are worshipping. Now, this introduces the idea that the gods of the Freljord can take on different shapes depending on who exactly is doing the worshipping of them, which is something that they kind of touched on a little bit before with Nunu and Willem, where Nunu's imagination literally has the power to change certain aspects of reality. But with the pivot from the thousand-pierced Eldritch Horror Volibear to the Volibear that we actually got, we now also introduce the possibility that champions like Anivia or Ornn could take completely different shapes depending on who exactly is doing the worshipping of them. Depending on exactly how the metaphysics of the world of League of Legends works, it's not something that Riot have ever fully explained or set down with rules, which is probably a sensible decision because it gives them more freedom to just create as they see fit. Now, once awoken by the desperate cry of this Freljordian tribe, Volibear obviously crushes the Noxians easily and is pretty pleased to be in battle killing things again, until he sees that the Freljordian tribe have also built a dam across the river, and he's like, a dam? That's a new thing. I don't like new things. Only old things are good, and so he decides to smash the dam because it's his river, and these goddamn kids don't have the right to come along here and dam up the dam just because it makes, like, their lives better or whatever. Smash the dam, unleash the river, and then he screams at the little Freljordians like, you're free from the dam now, which was bad because of reasons. I have watched a lot of Black Mirror. Technology is bad. Einstein was a witch. And because he's a giant god bear the size of a mountain, the Freljordians take him pretty seriously, and he gains some new followers who presumably from now on will sacrifice to him and empower him with their faith. Then, as the story says, the Volibear gave her a nod and turned to the horizon. There was much to be done. The implication here being that now awoken, he's gonna set about restoring the true faith of the Volibear across all of Freljord, which I'm curious to see whether or not the true faith of the Volibear will be in opposition to whatever faith it was that produced the Eldritch horror Thousand-Pierced Bear. Now, I've been making memes and jokes about how Volibear is essentially the boomer of the Freljord, but on a more serious note, he does seem to represent a kind of cult of tradition, rejection of modernism, action for action's sake, chest-pounding anti-intellectual meathead machismo that holds that any way of life that isn't a constant bloody-minded struggle for survival, preferably involving a lot of murder, is weak and unworthy. And while, of course, League of Legends definitely doesn't have any politics in it, and you definitely shouldn't think about things like that, if you were to hypothetically think about politics in a video game, Volibear would embody a kind of social Darwinist hyper-conservatism that stands in stark and direct opposition especially to the egalitarianism and politics of care that inform Ashe's Avarosans, who, make a point out of the whole thing of, maybe we don't have to suffer and die all the time in the Freljord. Maybe we can, help each other and not be miserable all the time. Wouldn't that be a thing? So while the easy way to write Volibear and his followers would be stereotypical fantasy meathead jocks, people who are violent and dangerous but also just kinda dumb, I do hope the writing will engage a little bit more seriously with the themes of politics that are present in it, except of course that's only hypothetical because as we all know there's no politics in League of Legends whatsoever. Oh hey Silas, I didn't see you there. So, as a character design, there isn't that much to say about Volibear, at least not on the surface. He's a bear who walks on two legs. And that's kind of it. He has a pair of magical runestones sitting on the end of his braided mane. His fur is covered in patterns that look like tattoos, which have the added feature of also lighting up when he's using his lightning powers. But the main thing that really makes him look like, a demigod rather than just a slightly unusual bear are the horns, quills, shards, whatever the heck they are, that poke out of his back. Now, I think there is a point to this relative aesthetic simplicity. Volibear's entire lore is about rejecting the complexities of a modern existence in favor of the simplicity and brutality of a style of existence that's much closer, at least in Volibear's opinion, to nature. And so in that sense, a complex design doesn't really make sense for him because he's all about a return to simplicity. But one of the consequences of that is that on a design level, Volibear is very much a what you see is what you get champion. Now, personally, given that he's all about hard living and battle and proving your mettle against the ravages of nature and etc., I would have liked him to have a few more visible scars, battle scars especially, some kind of visual indicator of the kind of life that he wants his followers to lead. It would, for example, have been cool if he had, lots of swords stuck in his back that sort of indicated, oh, this guy's been in, thousands of battles, he's been pierced 1,000 times. And it could also have been cool, in order to emphasize his connection with the wildness of nature, if he was more of a chimera character, if he was a combination of more than one animal. Maybe he had, I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud here, maybe if he had, animal antlers or something, or a skull for a head, so he's also, associated with death somehow. That would be a really cool character design for a character like Volibear. If only something like that exists. Oh, look at that! It's the Thousand-Pierced Volibear skin. What's that doing here? So, we don't normally talk about skins on this series, but I'm making an exception here because, first of all, I still genuinely believe that the Thousand-Pierced Volibear version of the character would have been more interesting. And again, that doesn't mean you're wrong if you prefer the old one, or if you would like something that's closer to the traditional character. That's a completely valid position to have, but at least in my opinion, when it comes to expressing the themes of him being an antithesis to civilization, an antithesis to the kinds of ways that modern humans live, having him be quite literally an alien creature, something inscrutable that has a presence that's unnerving and frightening and not just, intimidating, to me, that would have served his themes in a much more interesting and compelling way than it does to just have, a big bear with lightning powers. The Thousand-Pierced Volibear skin doesn't go quite as far in making him this alien eldritch presence as perhaps it would if that had been the entire theme of the rework. After all, the skin has to fit over the normal Volibear rig, but I do at least take a little bit of comfort in knowing that technically speaking, Thousand-Pierced Volibear is still canon, even if it turns out not to be the true form of the character. As a last little note, an interesting thing about the way that they formed Volibear's anatomy is that they have made his upper body visually much larger and more imposing than his lower. Now, partly that's to mimic the actual anatomy of a bear standing on its hind legs, but notice how when an actual bear stands on its hind legs, you always get the sense that it's really stretching itself. The neck is very long relative to where its nominal shoulders would be. With Volibear, they add a human-like musculature to his upper body and his arms with visible pecs and biceps, and they use the big fuzzy mane to essentially add a bunch of visual bulk to his shoulders, which eliminates that sense of a neck being stretched unsteadily. It eliminates that sense of an animal standing in an unnatural position. This makes him visually a lot more humanoid without sacrificing the sense of him as an animal that could go on four legs if it so wanted. And speaking of Volibear as a humanoid character, let's talk about... So, I've been quite excited to talk about the animation of this big boy, and not just because he's a perfectly well-animated, large, handsome bear man, but because, well, we'll get to that in a second. Let's start by just appreciating his idle pose and how much character storytelling it does for the personality of the bear that's being inhabited here. Like, you look at this way of just standing still, being idle, and what does that tell you about the mental state and indeed the attitude of the character in question? Clenched fist, one hand open to display the claws. Every time he breathes out, he gets this shaking going on, like he's tensing all his muscles, like he's barely holding back something. And his breathing, too, is like, that's not like a normal breathing you would do if you were relaxed. This is very heavy breathing, inflating the entire torso, like you can see it swelling on him right there. And even a little detail which I love, take a look at his nose. It's expanding every time he breathes in and deflating every time he breathes out. So this is someone who's standing with a clenched fist and going... Like, this is someone who is barely holding back a lot of power and aggression. Someone who's ready for a fight, not necessarily full of anger currently, not necessarily exploding right now, but who certainly is keeping the option open of exploding into action and violence sometime in the near future. This is one of the things I love about Volibear, is that his animations, generally speaking, do a great job of introducing us to who this character is and what kinds of things that are on their mind, how they feel about the world that they're inhabiting, which is good character acting. I also like Volibear because of... this! Volibear has some truly excellent animation smear frames. And as you know, if you've been following my channel for any amount of time, I live for animation smear frames because they are just the most glorious weirdness that you're ever gonna see in your entire life. And the relevant question when you see a frame like this with the character so deformed, so stretched out of all proportion and all sense, like what the hell is even happening to his shoulder here, is to ask the question, why? That seems excessive. That seems like a little much. I mean, even when you see it in motion, you kind of get the sense, especially right over here, that like, oh, there's something going on here, like there's some kind of big deformation happening. So why go to all that trouble? Well, let's do this. And now, because we're zoomed out, because the character in general is just smaller on our screen, the distortions and the stretching that's happening to the character model is also much less visible. And now the stretchings and distortions are doing the job for which they are designed, which is to emphasize the character's motion from the perspective that the player is most likely to see him, which is from above, from a certain distance. He's not going to be that big on your screen, so the character's motions have to be correspondingly bigger and more extreme in order to really read from the distance that we're viewing him. So when we view Volibear up close like this, we are doing something a little bit unfair because this is just not, this perspective right here is just not what the model was ever designed to be looked at from. But it does give us some insight into the animation process of a large character like this. And you may remember if you watched the What's the Deal with Mordekaiser video, that Mordekaiser 2 has a bunch of really extreme squash and stretch things going on with his character, especially when he's attacking. And part of the reason for that is because, especially when Riot are working with these large characters, part of what the animation has to do is sell their weight and power as physical presences in the world. And that comes across really well with Volibear in his run animation with boots. Now, modern League of Legends characters, generally speaking, have a few different run animations and walk animations depending on what's happening to their character. Like when they're home guarding, for example, they tend to have a certain type of run animation when they're slowed, when they're just walking, and when they have like various speed stats on them, typically movement speed. And this is Volibear's, not his fastest moving state, but one of the fast motions that he's got when he's running with really effective boots. Now, notice the nature of his run here. This is not a very smooth motion, like at all. You can really see it if you look at his upper body, that like it's like fa-dunk, 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 like there's this boom, boom. This weight to the upper body that's really on display in everything that this animation is doing. So let's take a look at what exactly is happening. You can really see here that as the foot comes down, this is the lowest point that the foot is gonna be at. It has hit the ground, but the upper body is going to take a while to catch up with it. Boom. You see that, like, that drop, boom, all the way down. And then, as you see, he's bending his leg, getting ready to take the next step. Here, his leg is fully extended, like his leg is fully into the next part of the motion, but his upper body is still hanging around, like, all the way down here. And as he gets fully into the stride, you see how the upper body, again, follows behind the motion of the legs. It sort of reacts to whatever the legs are doing. And again, one leg comes down. We have this very stretched out pose right here. And it takes a while for the torso to just come down and completely land before he lifts it up off the ground once again. And that's what gives this animation this sense of enormous weight just being tossed around the battlefield. You can really see, especially with the giant swinging arms that are really exaggerating his motion. This is a big, heavy guy with a ton of power coming right at you. And again, for as exaggerated as it looks up close, once you zoom out a little bit, it becomes much more conservative and kind of sensible looking. And one detail I really love is, I don't know if it's that visible from here, but take a look at Volibear's jaw. You see how his jaw also is doing a lot of swinging around, like it's swinging from left to right as he's running? Almost as though he's like just letting it hang slack-jawed under him, kind of following along with the motions of the head. In a way that, again, helps give him this fluidity. Like, there is this smoothness and fluidity to him, even as he does this ka-dunk, 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 kind of almost awkward run that looks like he's almost struggling to lift the weight of his own entire body. Like, he's just so jacked that it's hard to move. He does have, however, another run animation as well. Let me see if I can find it. This one. Now, this is the run that he uses for his spell when he gets a movement speed buff and is moving towards you to do a very evil, mean thing to you. And this has a very different characteristic to it. Gone is that hyper-exaggerated up and down motion of the torso, where it's almost like there's a sack of potatoes that is sort of being thrown around by the movement of his legs. This is a much smoother motion with a lot less extreme up and down bobbing. But something else that's also not happening is there's no squash and stretch horizontally along Volibear's body. As he's running along, even as he extends the front of his arms, there's probably a little stretching going on there, but even as he extends the front of his arms, you can see there's no situation where, like, the torso moves forward first, and then the back legs and the back side of the body sort of squashes in to meet it. It's much more up and down focused, where you have this cadence where front legs come up almost at the same time as the back legs. We get him in this pose in the air, where the back legs and the front legs come up pretty much at the same time. Then the front legs come down. Then the back legs come down. And then as he kicks off from the ground once again, both legs sort of get into the air at, like, roughly the same speed, So there's this deferred cadence where it's like, get into the air at the same speed, but then front legs come down first, back legs follow, and the front legs wait for the back legs until we kick off once more, and we get back into our flying pose in the air. And that has a very different nature, a very different cadence. It's a very different style of fast run to look at this compared to this. Like, there's much more a sense of him, like, lugging around a huge weight on him. And that comes down to the differences in how Riot's animators want the players to read those two animations. Because when Volibear is doing his Predator run at you, when he's doing this, you know as a player that, oh, something special is going on with him. He's got something active right now that's bad, and I should avoid it. Something unusual is happening right now. There's a change in state in the character that communicates the change in game state, which is Volibear currently has a temporary buff activated that will allow him to do something terrible to you if you allow him to get close. Whereas, with his Boots run, which is really just an exaggerated version of his ordinary run. Like, so you've seen him running around on the battlefield in an ordinary way the whole time. So when he runs like this, it's like, oh, he's just faster. But it's not like he's got a spell active right now that means I need to look out for him. So there's this difference in communication from the animators about what should you expect the character to do and be able to do based on the animation that they've got going on. Speaking of character animation, take a look at Volibear's face here. There is some real fun stuff going on with Volibear's face in this animation. And I'm just going to see if I can catch it for you here. As what he's got going on here is a juggling animation. Unfortunately, the animation viewer here doesn't render the things that he's juggling, which I think is a bunch of poros, if I remember correctly. But there is a thing going on with facial animation for Volibear here, which again, remember, you're viewing that from here, pretty much. So, in order to really emphasize that he's, like, opening his eyes, like, he's really opening his eyes wide, he's abandoning the scowl that he's normally wearing, like, 99.9% of the time, and opening his eyes and looking at the things that he's holding in his hand. He's really pleased with himself that he's juggling. Again, from a distance, it looks fine. But once you get in close, you realize, oh, wow, there's like a lot of stretching going on of his upper eyelids because he goes from this to this. Again, over-exaggeration, but look at the character moment that it delivers. All of a sudden, rather than being this big scary bear, because he's got the eyes open wide rather than scowling, he looks a little cute. And as he opens his mouth to be kind of pleased with himself like that, is like, oh, look at that, he's a juggling bear, isn't that adorable? Which only works because this is his joke animation, and absolutely would not work if this was happening at any other point in his animation, because like 99% of the time, even when he's celebrating because he's happy that he won a fight, Volibear is scowling permanently. And there's a... Do you notice this, by the way? In this celebration animation where, like, he punches his chest like he's a gorilla for some reason. Do you see that? The model is shaking. Almost as though he's shaking the very ground with his roar, which is an interesting little effect to apply to the model itself, rather than apply the shaking effect to the game screen, which is what you'd usually do, or to the game world. It's being applied to the character model itself to really give the sense that this is like a really loud, powerful roar. And for that, it works absolutely perfectly, because you really do get the sense of, like, the whole world being shaken by the victory scream of the Volibear. Roar! And there's some good acting going on in... And when I say acting, I don't necessarily mean acting as in emotional acting. When I say acting, I mean acting as in, oh, like the character is doing this motion in a way that's really believable and cool. So take a look at when he pounds himself on the chest. The fist hits, and then his face does a little... Ugh. Like, it doesn't look like pain, but he has a little reaction to punching himself in the chest, like he's doing it really hard. Like he's really hitting himself, like, in a way that he can feel. Like, it's not just a tap, it's like a pound, a really hard thing that would probably kill any normal mortal if he did it to them, but to the Volibear, roar, it's just because he's so big and manly and he wants to make the Freljord great again and yada yada yada. And this, too, is a lovely bit of character acting, because, again, you see the squash and stretch happening, right? You can see how the lower body drops first, and then the upper body follows. And then he compresses himself down into this ball, and then raises up, and then, woof, unleashes. And as he unleashes, take a look at his neck. You see how it stretches and stretches and stretches all the way out until he's expelling air and expelling air and expelling air. He's expelling everything inside him, just like letting all of it out. And then, humph. Right, like rather than kind of deflating with like, oh god, I'm out of air, like, he deflates with like a, humph, I could have done that for 10 more minutes if I wanted to. Like this confident kind of like power slice with the hand, like, yeah, that's enough. Let's go kill some more stuff we can scream about. And again, good acting. It gives you a sense of who this character is, what he wants, how he feels when he's doing the actions that he's doing. So, something else that's excellently squashed and stretched is his face. And I'm a little confused by this because, like, from here, you don't really get to see Volibear's lower jaw. You don't really get to see much of, like, what his face is doing. But the animators just decided to, or the animator, it's probably only one major character animator working on this, decided nonetheless to really go hard on the squash and stretch on Volibear's entire face. And again, the point of it is to sell the power of the motion, because you can see there's this wind-up thing happening where his arm goes up, he's about to strike, but this paw is going to pretty much just stay up here for a good long while now. You see that? The whole front of his body moves forward first, and you get this almost elastic pull. Almost like this arm is so massive, it has so much inertia, that it takes like a huge effort just to move it into the swing that's coming. So you get this elastic, like, building up of tension, and then snap! As the paw finally connects with whatever it is he's trying to kill. Pow! Like so. And that's something that helps really sell the power of the hit, right? You can really see, like, it's not just that he swipes his paw at you. It's not like a, it's like a, you get this build-up of tension and then release. Release. Build-up, release. Build-up, release. And it's hard to see when the thing is, like, going at full speed, but when you slow it down, you really can see, like, the language of motion that's being used here. And of course, as always with big attack animations, the paw inflates a little bit as it hits the opponent and then deflates back down to its normal size as he, like, eases out of the attack animation and goes into his secondary attack, which has the same thing going on, like with this slow buildup of tension and then snap, which works really well. And he's got this double attack cadence thing going on where he's got this attack, and then he's got that attack, and then he's got this attack, and then he's got that attack. So you get this, like, really the sense of a bear mauling somewhere where it's like left, right, left, right. There's no martial arts here. There's no sensible punching. It's just a bear that's swinging its giant claws at your face because it knows that it's going to take your head off with every swipe that it does. It's just brute strength with very little finesse, very little sort of, there's no boxing stance going on here. There's no karate. There's no nothing. It's just, here's my giant paw, smack right in your face, and that's going to do enough damage because I am a bear and you are dead. And as the final animation to take a look at, let's have a look at Volibear's laugh. Now here again, there's a lot of exaggeration going on the face, and I think you can probably even get a sense of that from, like, a game perspective. Like, you can see that there's a lot going on with the black void of his mouth that's communicating where his head is and what it's doing at all times. And if we zoom in on that, you can really see what's going on here. Like, you can really see the mouth is being stretched open enormously to really deliver this big, giant, happy belly laugh from Volibear, because, like, he doesn't do anything by half. He doesn't just go ha ha ha. He goes rah, ha, 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 like full out, just shouting The whole body is active when Volibear laughs. It's not just a ha ha ha. It's, you can see, it's the whole thing of like swinging the arms up, bursting out laughing, and then coming back down, like slapping himself on the knee even as he comes down, sort of steadying himself against his own knee, holding his stomach like,
that is the funniest thing I've ever heard.
Like that kind of thing. And you can see the laughter bursts out of him. It's not a regular motion. It's not just ha ha ha. It's ha 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 ha. Like you have this real sense of energy and unleashed emotion, like unleashed feeling. There's no shyness here. He's not shy about letting you know exactly how he's feeling right now. How he's feeling is that you have done or said something absolutely hilarious. Probably you died in a funny way or something. And it's being emphasized even further. And it's kind of hard to see, but you can probably see it on one of the pops. Yeah, here. As he laughs, his head literally inflates. You can see the snout, especially his snout. Like, look how short the snout is here relative to here. So when he does one of the really big laughs, there's even this little inflation, deflation of the head itself to really emphasize the power of that ha. And it delivers like a laugh that really... This guy looks like he's having more fun than anyone has ever had in their entire life, doesn't he? Like, he looks like he's really just heard a great joke. And again, that's Volibear. He's unleashed feeling. There's nothing hidden about him. There's no social graces. There's no shyness. There's no humility. There's no anything. When he laughs completely, fully, from the core of his body out to the corners of the world. Everyone knows when Volibear laughs, which again is part of his character, this unleashed beast of a thing that just wants everyone to live according to their natural instincts. This is how that character would laugh, and that's what makes Volibear's animation so good. It is at this point very old hat to say that Riot's reworks of a character are, like, universally superior to the characters that they're reworked from, and Volibear is no exception to this. Conceptually, he works better as a world-building element of the Freljord, I think, if he's a god rather than the leader of a tribe of Ursine, because, as we noted earlier on in the episode, the concept of an armored bear walking around as like a normal thing in the world is, no matter how seriously you take it in the lore, a little bit goofy just on a fundamental level. And while I will be the first one to say that I miss the days of League of Legends being a bit more campy and silly and taking itself a little bit less seriously than it does nowadays, Volibear as a nature god of the Freljord ultimately provides better storytelling opportunities, I think, than Volibear, the tribal leader of the Freljord. We've already got 3 of those, we kinda don't need another one in the mix. Now, I will forever be a little bit annoyed that we didn't get the 1000-pierced Volibear that I specifically wanted, but on the assumption that Riot will do the work of following up on his lore, especially his interactions with Sejuani and Udyr, I do look forward to seeing how Volibear's role plays out in the Freljord, especially when and or if, probably never, but you can always hope, that he gets into a confrontation with Lysandra and the Awakening Watchers, who are slowly freeing themselves from the Howling Abyss. Hey, thank you very much for watching another episode of What's the Deal With. If you've enjoyed this video, then I would like for you to express that enjoyment by clicking the like, comment, and or subscribe buttons in whatever combination you feel like. Maybe also the bell icon, because YouTube's algorithms track how many people hit the buttons, and how many people hit the buttons determines how much engagement the video got, and if the video gets lots of engagement, that means people get to see it and I get to pay rent, and if it doesn't get a lot of engagement, then, I don't know, I'm dragged screaming into YouTube hell by robots that invade my house in the night. I don't want to find out, is my point, so please click the buttons and make the numbers go up. If you want to support me more directly, then I have a Patreon, I have a merchandise store, and I have a tip jar. You can use any of them if you want to, but if you don't want to, that's completely okay as well. Believe me, I get it, like, times are tight, and it's not like we all have a lot of money to throw around these days. Still, at the end of my videos, I always try to encourage people to, generally speaking, support content that they enjoy with direct contributions of however much they can, whenever they can. Because if you have an online content creator whose work you enjoy, a $1 donation towards that makes the difference of literally thousands of views under the advertising algorithm. It has so much more of an impact than you think. So whether it's me or someone else, if there's an online content creator, especially a niche content creator whose work you enjoy, please consider supporting them directly with anything you can, whenever you can. And if you don't want to throw money at internet content nowadays, again, believe me, I get it, but I do also have a link at the top of the description to a page that'll take you to some charities that could really use your help right about now because of all of the everything that is happening. Anyway, I'm done asking you for money, so I'm gonna go back to asking you for clicks on YouTube. So I've also got a second channel where I do Let's Plays of various things. We're currently playing through Final Fantasy X with Final Fantasy XII to follow. We're playing through Monster Hunter Iceborne, The World Ends With You, and I'm doing a little bit of Legends of Runeterra over there every once in a while. And at some point in the future, I'll also find a way to get back to streaming over there some more. So if you want to see any of that, then you can like, comment, and subscribe on that thing as well, because algorithms rule my life. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. Please remember to wash your hands, and if you're going outside, do everybody around you a favor and wear a mask.